Blood stained the mahogany floor of the federal interrogation room. Penelope Harper, a 250-pound secretary with ink-stained fingers and a terrified heartbeat, stared down the seasoned detectives and confessed to a sprawling, racketeering enterprise she knew absolutely nothing about. She was intentionally throwing her entire life away to protect Leo Castiglione, the most ruthless mob boss in Chicago. But what she didn't was that Leo was already standing outside the precinct, and he knew exactly who had set them both up. Penelope Harper did not fit into the sleek, blood-soaked world of the Castiglione crime family. She was a woman of substantial size, her soft, heavy curves usually hidden beneath thick wool cardigans, sensible pleated skirts, and oversized coats. In a sprawling criminal empire where the women were typically tall, razor-thin models draped in stolen diamonds and designer silk, Penelope was the glaring anomaly. She was fat, unapologetically quiet, and perpetually overlooked by the hardened criminals who walked through the doors of Castiglione Logistics. But what the soldiers and capos failed to realize was that Penelope held the entire organization together. She was the gatekeeper to Leo Castiglione. Leo was a man carved from ice and violence, a second-generation boss who had taken a fractured syndicate and forged it into an untouchable corporate machine. He trusted no one. He didn't trust his underboss, Ricky Navarro, who smiled too widely. He didn't trust his enforcers, but he trusted the chubby, soft-spoken woman who sat at the heavy oak desk outside his office. Penelope knew the real ledgers. She knew which shipping containers coming into the Navy pier held imported olive oil, and which held unregistered firearms from Victor O'Rourke's Irish syndicates. She remembered every number, every bribe, and every alias. And most importantly, she never asked questions. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in November when the fragile illusion of their corporate legitimacy shattered. Penelope was sitting at her desk, a half-eaten blueberry muffin resting on a napkin next to her keyboard. She was meticulously cross-referencing a series of offshore wire transfers, her thick fingers flying across the keys with practiced grace. Inside the glass-walled office behind her, Leo was pacing, listening to Ricky Navarro complain about a delayed shipment. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the reception area burst open. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the synchronized heavy thud of tactical boots. Federal agents poured into the lobby, their windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. Leading the charge was Special Agent Thomas Miller, a man who had spent the last 4 years obsessively trying to pin a RICO charge on Leo. "Nobody move! Hands away from the keyboards!" Miller barked, his eyes immediately locking onto the frosted glass of Leo's inner sanctum. Panic erupted in the bullpen. Low-level accountants scrambled, kicking over trash cans. But Penelope didn't scream. Her heart slammed against her rib cage, a frantic bird trapped in her chest, but her mind snapped into razor-sharp focus. She knew exactly why they were here. 2 days ago, Ricky Navarro had handed her a highly classified encrypted hard drive containing the O'Rourke payoff logs, the only piece of concrete evidence that directly tied Leo Castiglione to a string of illegal arms distributions. Leo had told her to format it, but the decryption process was agonizingly slow and was only 70% complete. If Miller got his hands on that drive, Leo was going to federal prison for the rest of his life. Penelope's heavy chest heaved as she looked through the glass. Leo was staring back at her. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the untouchable mob boss slipped, and Penelope saw raw, unfiltered realization in his dark eyes. He knew he was caught. He was bracing for the end. She couldn't let that happen. Over the past 5 years, Leo had been the only man in this brutal city who had treated her with genuine respect. When others made crude jokes about her weight, Leo had brutally broken a capo's jaw. He had paid for her mother's medical bills without a word. He looked at her not as a punchline, but as an equal. Penelope grabbed the encrypted hard drive from the dock. It was roughly the size of a thick deck of cards. She quickly shoved it deep into the front pocket of her oversized, bulky cardigan, letting her heavy frame conceal the rectangular bulge perfectly. Agent Miller reached her desk, slapping a search warrant down on her keyboard. "Step away from the desk, lady. Now." I don't understand," Penelope stammered, artificially raising her voice to sound panicked and incompetent. She let her shoulders slump, playing into every stereotype they held about her. Just a slow, easily frightened, overweight receptionist. "Where is the master ledger?" Miller demanded, leaning over her desk, smelling of stale coffee and cheap cologne. "We know it's here. Navarro's offshore accounts, the O'Rourke drops. Where are they?" Penelope's eyes darted toward the glass office. Leo was being handcuffed by 2 agents, his jaw clenched in quiet fury. Ricky Navarro was standing near the wall, his hands raised. But Penelope noticed something chilling. Ricky's hands weren't shaking. His breathing was calm. He looked entirely too relaxed for a man facing 20 years in maximum security. "I manage the books," Penelope said, her voice suddenly dropping its terrified pitch. She looked Agent Miller dead in the eye. "All of them." Miller frowned, looking at her soft, round face, her thick glasses, and the pastry crumbs on her desk. "You? You're the architect of $100 million money laundering operation? Mr. Castiglione is just a figurehead," Penelope lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, but she pushed them out with steady conviction. "He signs the clean invoices. I created the shell companies. I diverted the funds. The encrypted drive you're looking for. I engineered it to steal from the company. Mr. Castiglione knows nothing about it." Silence fell over the immediate area. Through the open door of his office, Leo froze. He stared at Penelope, his dark eyes wide with shock. He opened his mouth to order her to shut up, to stop this insane suicide mission. But an agent shoved him roughly toward the door. "Penelope, don't say another word!" Leo roared, his voice tearing through the chaos of the raid. "Miller, she's a secretary. She doesn't know what the hell she's talking about." "I have the offshore routing numbers memorized, Agent Miller," Penelope continued, ignoring Leo's desperate shout. She began reciting the complex alphanumeric codes Ricky Navarro had used for the Cayman accounts. She knew them by heart. Miller's eyes lit up with predatory glee. He had come for the king. But this woman was handing him the entire kingdom's blueprint. "Arrest her," Miller snapped to a deputy. "Read her rights." Cold steel snapped around Penelope's thick wrists. They pinched her skin, but she didn't wince. As they marched her past Leo, she kept her eyes glued to the floor. She was taking the blame. She was taking the fall. And as the elevator doors closed on her, swallowing her into the belly of the justice system, she knew she would likely never see the sunlight as a free woman again. The interrogation room at the FBI field office was designed to break the human spirit. It was freezing cold, windowless, and smelled faintly of ammonia and old sweat. Penelope sat at a metal table, her wrists still tightly bound. The steel chair groaned slightly under her weight, a humiliating sound that usually made her flush red. But today, she felt entirely numb. The hard drive was still in her cardigan pocket. The agents hadn't thoroughly patted her down yet, assuming she was exactly what she looked like. A harmless, overweight corporate drone who had cracked under pressure. Agent Miller slammed a thick file onto the table, making Penelope flinch. "Let's stop playing games, Penelope," Miller said, pulling up a chair and leaning in close. "You're looking at 45 years. You will die in federal prison. A woman like you? Soft, quiet. You won't last a week in general population. Give me Leo Castiglione. Tell me he ordered the O'Rourke drops, and I'll get the U.S. attorney to offer you immunity. You can walk out of here today. Go home and eat a whole damn cake if you want to." The casual cruelty of the fat joke stung, but Penelope swallowed the hurt. She had endured worse from better men. "I told you," Penelope said softly, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm as bedrock. "Mr. Castiglione is not involved. I noticed a vulnerability in the company's supply chain logs. I exploited it. I created the dummy corporations. I embezzled the funds." Miller slammed his fist on the table. "You're lying! You don't have the stomach for this. We had an inside tip. We know the O'Rourke ledgers were sitting in that office today. My informant guaranteed it." Penelope's breath hitched. An inside tip. Her brilliant, analytical mind began to race. Only 3 people in the entire world knew that the O'Rourke ledgers were in the office that morning. Leo, Penelope, and the man who had handed them to her, Ricky Navarro. It wasn't a random raid. It was a calculated assassination of Leo's freedom. Ricky had tipped off the feds, timed the raid perfectly, and planned to let Leo take the fall so he could seize control of the Castiglione family. "I don't know what your informant told you," Penelope said, leaning back in her chair, her heavy frame settling into an immovable posture. "But they lied. I acted alone." Meanwhile, 3 miles away, in a dimly lit warehouse in the meat-packing district, Leo Castiglione was violently pacing the concrete floor. He had been released on a technicality. His lawyers had argued successfully that without the physical hard drive or a confession tying him to the documents, the arrest was premature. But he was far from relieved. His suit jacket was discarded, his tie ripped off, and his knuckles were bruised from punching a steel support pillar. "How the hell did she do it?" Leo snarled, his voice a dangerous, gravelly whisper that made the armed men in the room step back. Ricky Navarro was leaning against a stack of wooden crates, playing the part of the concerned loyalist. "Leo." The girl panicked. "She was stealing from you, boss." She confessed. "It's a blessing in disguise. The feds took the bait, she takes the fall, and we sweep the rest under the rug." Leo stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Ricky. The silence in the warehouse grew so heavy it felt suffocating. "Stealing from me," Leo repeated softly. He walked toward Ricky, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Penelope Harper has worked for me for 5 years. 3 years ago, I accidentally left a duffel bag containing $200,000 in unmarked bills in the trunk of a company car. She found it. She didn't take a single dime. She locked it in my personal safe and waited in the office until 3 a.m. to hand me the key." Leo stopped mere inches from Ricky's face. "She lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen. She takes the bus to work. She uses coupons at the grocery store. You're telling me this woman orchestrated a massive international money laundering scheme under my nose and kept none of the profits?" Ricky swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "People hide their true colors, Leo. Maybe she got greedy. Or maybe," Leo whispered, his tone dropping an octave into something purely demonic. Somebody fed her to the wolves to save their own skin. Leo's mind flashed back to the raid. He remembered the look of sheer terror on Penelope's face, immediately followed by a resolve so fierce it took his breath away. She had deliberately drawn the FBI's fire. She had made herself the target, so he could walk out those doors. This woman, who was constantly mocked for her size, who was ignored by the flashy sycophants of his world, had thrown herself on a grenade for him. And then Leo realized the missing piece. The hard drive. The FBI hadn't found it. He knew they hadn't, because if they had, he wouldn't be standing in this warehouse right now. Penelope had hidden it. She had smuggled it out right under Miller's nose. Leo pulled a custom-engraved 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster and calmly checked the chamber. "Ricky," Leo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Who knew the O'Rourke drive was in the office today? Ricky's eyes darted toward the exit. A fatal mistake. "Only you and me, boss, and the fat girl." The casual disrespect in Ricky's voice was the final straw. Leo didn't yell. He didn't blink. He just raised the weapon and slammed the heavy steel barrel directly into Ricky's kneecap. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the warehouse, followed instantly by Ricky's agonizing scream. The underboss collapsed to the concrete, clutching his shattered leg, sobbing violently. "Her name," Leo said quietly, standing over the bleeding traitor, "is Penelope. And she has more loyalty in her little finger than you have in your entire miserable bloodline." Leo looked up at his remaining men. "Gag him. Tie him to a chair. He's going to tell me exactly what he promised the FBI. And then I am going to tear this city down brick by brick until I get my secretary back." Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the federal holding facility. Penelope sat on a rigid metal bench inside a temporary holding cell, her thick thighs pressing together as she tried to make herself as small as possible. The heavy wool cardigan still draped over her shoulders was her only armor against the freezing air conditioning. But the real danger wasn't the cold. It was the inevitable protocol of the justice system. In less than 20 minutes, she would be transferred to the main county jail for processing. That meant a full strip search. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her heavy stomach. The encrypted hard drive was still sitting like a lead weight in her front pocket. If the female deputies found it during the strip search, Leo's freedom would evaporate instantly, and her entire sacrifice would be rendered completely meaningless. She had to get rid of it. Footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor. A female deputy with a severe bun and a sour expression stopped outside the bars. "Harper, on your feet. Time for processing." Penelope's mind raced. She leaned forward, clutching her heavy chest, and began to hyperventilate. It wasn't entirely an act. The sheer terror of her situation was already pushing her blood pressure to dangerous heights. She let her breathing turn ragged, squeezing her eyes shut as a sheen of genuine sweat broke out across her forehead. I can't breathe," Penelope gasped, leaning her considerable weight against the bars. She allowed her knees to buckle slightly, a terrifying prospect for the deputy who clearly did not want to deal with a medical emergency or attempt to lift a 250-pound woman off the concrete floor. Hey, calm down," the deputy snapped, unlocking the cell door. "You're having a panic attack. Breathe." I need to use the restroom. Please. I think I'm going to be sick," Penelope choked out, clutching her stomach. "Please, I have a severe gastrointestinal condition. The deputy groaned in disgust, but grabbed Penelope's arm, hauling her out of the cell. Down the hall. 2 minutes. If you throw up on my floor, I'm adding a destruction of property charge. Penelope was shoved into a single-stall bathroom devoid of mirrors or windows. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind her. She didn't have 2 minutes. She had 60 seconds. Her thick fingers trembled violently as she yanked the hard drive from her cardigan pocket. It was encased in hard black plastic, secured with tiny screws she had no tools to remove. Desperation fueled her. She placed the hard drive on the concrete floor, wedging it against the base of the metal toilet. Lifting her heavy, sensible orthopedic shoe, Penelope brought her heel down with all her weight. Crack. The plastic casing splintered, but the drive remained intact. Outside, the deputy banged on the door. "Wrap it up, Harper." Penelope bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She stomped again, channeling every ounce of fear, every cruel joke she had ever endured, and every shred of loyalty she possessed for Leo Castiglione into her right foot. The plastic shattered completely. Dropping to her thick knees, ignoring the sharp sting of the bruised concrete, Penelope frantically dug through the broken shards. There it was. The micro-SD memory chip, no larger than a fingernail, containing 50 gigabytes of damning offshore ledgers. She scooped up the broken plastic pieces and dumped them into the toilet, pressing the industrial flush button. The plumbing roared, swallowing the casing. But the micro-SD card couldn't be flushed. It was too light. It could float back up, or worse, get caught in the basin grate. "Time's up," the deputy barked, the lock clicking open. Penelope placed the tiny data chip on her tongue, squeezed her eyes shut, and swallowed dry. It scratched the back of her throat, a sharp, terrifying sensation, but it went down, settling deep into her heavy stomach. She turned around just as the door swung open, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. "I'm ready," Penelope whispered, her secret buried deep inside her. Miles away, the atmosphere in the meat-packing warehouse was thick with the copper stench of blood. Ricky Navarro was strapped to a reinforced steel chair, his shattered kneecap leaking crimson onto the floor. Leo Castiglione stood over him, peeling off his blood-spattered leather gloves. The mob boss's usually impeccably groomed hair was disheveled, and his dark eyes burned with a chaotic, terrifying fury. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Ricky," Leo said, his voice a lethal whisper. "And if you lie to me again, I will have the boys bring out the blowtorch. What was the exact deal you made with Thomas Miller?" Ricky sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound that disgusted everyone in the room. He wanted you out, Leo. Miller wanted his career-making bust, but he didn't have the manpower to take the ports. Victor O'Rourke did. O'Rourke met with me last month. He said if I handed you to the feds, he'd absorb our remaining crews. I'd be his top lieutenant. We'd run Chicago together. "And you used Penelope as the distraction," Leo stated, his jaw locking so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. "She was nobody," Ricky screamed in desperate defense. "She's just a fat cow who answers the phones. I figured Miller would toss her aside once he realized she was useless. I didn't know she was going to confess." A deadly silence fell over the room. Leo stared down at the man he had once considered a brother. "She is worth 1,000 of you," Leo murmured. He turned his back on Ricky and looked at his lead enforcer, a towering man named Bruno. "Finish him. Dump him in O'Rourke's territory. Make sure Victor knows a war has started." Leo walked out of the warehouse into the freezing Chicago night, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. He dialed a number that very few people in the world possessed. It rang only once. "Arthur," Leo said, his voice instantly shifting from a mob boss to a corporate apex predator. Arthur Pendleton, the most ruthless defense attorney in the state of Illinois, answered smoothly. "Good evening, Mr. Castiglione. I heard about the raid. I assume you need a miracle." "I don't need a miracle, Arthur. I need you to march into the federal courthouse tonight," Leo ordered, climbing into the back of his armored SUV. "They have my secretary, Penelope Harper. I want her out of federal custody before sunrise. I don't care who you have to bribe, what judge you have to threaten, or how many millions it takes. If she spends the night in a cell, you'll be joining Ricky Navarro." "Understood," Arthur replied without missing a beat. "I'll have her out." Leo hung up, staring out the tinted windows at the passing streetlights. His chest ached with a strange, unfamiliar tightness. For years, Penelope had just been a comforting presence, a quiet, fiercely intelligent woman who brought him black coffee and managed his chaotic life. But today, she had looked into the jaws of a federal dragon and thrown herself inside to shield him. He wasn't just going to save her. He was going to make sure the entire city bowed down to her. Judge Wallace Montgomery slammed his gavel down, the sharp wooden crack echoing through the cavernous federal courtroom of the Northern District of Illinois. It was 3:00 a.m., an emergency bail hearing orchestrated entirely by the sheer financial force of the Castiglione Empire. Penelope stood at the defense table, her heavy frame swathed in a stiff, poorly fitting orange jumpsuit that dug uncomfortably into her waist and thighs. Her thick wrists were still bruised purple from the handcuffs. She felt exhausted, humiliated, and utterly terrified. Beside her stood Arthur Pendleton, immaculate in a bespoke charcoal suit, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance. Agent Thomas Miller paced the prosecutor's side, his face purple with rage. "Your Honor, is a farce. The defendant confessed to masterminding a $100 million money laundering syndicate. She is a massive flight risk. We demand she be remanded without bail pending a grand jury indictment." Arthur adjusted his gold cufflinks, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, Agent Miller is operating on fiction. My client is a receptionist. She was terrified during a highly aggressive militarized raid, and she suffered a panic attack. She babbled a coerced confession under duress. Where is the evidence? Where is this mythical hard drive Agent Miller claims exists? They searched her. They strip-searched her. They found a half-eaten muffin on her desk and lint in her pockets. Penelope swallowed hard, her stomach giving a weird twinge. The memory of the strip search, the cruel smirks of the guards as she was forced to disrobe her heavy body, still burned her cheeks with shame. But they hadn't found the drive. The FBI's complete failure to produce a single shred of physical evidence makes holding Ms. Harper illegal, Arthur concluded smoothly. Judge Montgomery sighed, looking down at the paperwork. Agent Miller, without physical evidence corroborating this so-called confession, I cannot hold a citizen with zero criminal record without bail. Bail is set at $5 million. Cash. Miller smiled triumphantly, assuming that number was insurmountable for a mere secretary. But Arthur didn't even blink. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of certified cashier's checks. "Bail is posted, Your Honor," Arthur said coolly. Miller's jaw dropped. "She's a front. Castiglione is funding her. This proves her guilt." This proves she has a very generous employer who values his administrative staff, Arthur countered sharply. Miss Harper is free to go. 45 minutes later, Penelope was dressed back in her wool cardigan and sensible skirt, stepping out of the courthouse's heavy revolving doors into the bitter winter wind. She expected to walk to a bus stop, a convicted felon waiting for her eventual trial. Instead, a sleek, armored black Cadillac Escalade idled at the curb. The rear door swung open. "Get in, Miss Harper," Arthur said softly, standing by the door. Penelope hesitated, her thick legs trembling, before she climbed into the luxurious leather interior. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the deserted downtown streets. They didn't head south toward her cramped apartment in Pilsen. Instead, the vehicle glided north onto Lakeshore Drive, heading toward the affluent, heavily guarded estates of Highland Park. An hour later, the SUV passed through imposing wrought-iron gates, pulling up to a sprawling stone mansion overlooking Lake Michigan. Penelope was escorted through the grand foyer, her sensible shoes sinking into impossibly plush Persian rugs, until she was led into a massive fire-lit study. Standing by the roaring fireplace, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid, was Leo Castiglione. He looked exhausted, his tie missing and his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. But the moment Penelope entered the room, his dark eyes locked onto her with a terrifying intensity. Arthur quietly closed the heavy oak doors, leaving them alone. Penelope stood awkwardly by the door, her heavy arms wrapping around her waist in a defensive posture. "Mr. Castiglione, I'm sorry. I caused a mess. I couldn't let them take you." Leo didn't speak. He crossed the massive room in 4 long strides, his presence so overwhelming that Penelope instinctually took a step back. But Leo reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping her forearms. He looked down at her bruised wrists, his thumbs lightly tracing the purple marks left by the federal handcuffs. "They hurt you," Leo whispered, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, suppressed violence. "I'm fine," Penelope said, her cheeks flushing a deep, mottled red. "I'm thick-skinned." "Don't," Leo said sharply, though his grip remained impossibly gentle. "Don't diminish yourself. Not ever again. Not to me." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Ricky Navarro is dead. He sold us out to Victor O'Rourke and Agent Miller. I know everything. But what I don't know, Penelope, is how you did it. Miller tore that office apart. They strip-searched you. Where is the O'Rourke drive?" Penelope looked away, suddenly feeling incredibly foolish. I broke the plastic casing in the holding cell bathroom. I flushed it." Leo frowned, confusion crossing his sharp features. "And the memory chip? The data?" Penelope's face burned hotter. She pointed a trembling, ink-stained finger at her own heavy stomach. "I swallowed it." Silence stretched between them. Only the crackle of the fireplace filled the room. Leo stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity, the unbelievable bravery, wrapped in the soft, unassuming woman standing before him. Suddenly, a rich, dark laugh erupted from Leo's chest. It was a sound Penelope had never heard in 5 years, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and delight. "You swallowed federal evidence," Leo said, a fierce, predatory smile spreading across his face. He moved closer, the heat of his body radiating against her. "Penelope Harper, you are the most magnificent creature I have ever met." Penelope's breath hitched. No man had ever called her magnificent. They had called her sturdy. They had called her dependable. Most often, they just called her fat. "You're staying here," Leo commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are not going back to that apartment. You are not answering phones anymore. Victor O'Rourke is going to try to kill us both to cover his tracks, and Thomas Miller is going to tear the city apart, looking for that data. You are under my absolute protection." "Leo, I don't belong in a place like this," she whispered, looking down at her bulky, unfashionable clothes. Leo reached out, gently tilting her chin up, so she was forced to look into his intense, dark eyes. "You belong exactly where I say you belong, and right now, that is by my side. We are going to burn O'Rourke's empire to the ground, and we are going to do it together." Sunlight breached the heavy velvet curtains of the Castiglione estate, illuminating a suite that was larger than Penelope's entire apartment building in Pilsen. She sat on the edge of a massive four-poster bed, wearing a silk robe that Leo had ordered specifically in her size. For the first time in her life, the fabric didn't pinch her heavy waist or tightly bind her thick arms. It flowed over her curves effortlessly, making her feel dangerously elegant. But there was no time to luxuriate. They had a war to win. 48 hours had passed since her release from federal custody. Nature had predictably run its course, and a highly discreet, heavily compensated private physician named Dr. William Camden had sanitized the micro SD card. The tiny chip now sat plugged into a heavily encrypted laptop on the massive mahogany dining table downstairs. When Penelope descended the sweeping marble staircase, she found Leo standing over the laptop, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand. Two of his most lethal enforcers, heavily armed men named Dante and Rocco, stood guard by the reinforced windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Leo looked up, his dark eyes instantly softening as they swept over her. "You look beautiful, Penelope." Heat rushed to her plump cheeks. She pulled the silk robe tighter around her waist, instinctively trying to hide her bulk. "I look like a secretary wearing a mob boss's tailored silk." "You look like the woman who saved my life," Leo corrected, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. He pulled out a chair for her at the head of the table. "Sit. The decryption finished 10 minutes ago. I need your eyes on this." Penelope took her seat, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. As she pulled up the spreadsheets, her brilliant, analytical mind instantly went to work. She ignored the heavily armed men in the room and focused on the cascading rows of offshore routing numbers, shell corporation names, and wire transfer dates. These were Victor O'Rourke's private books. Ricky Navarro had stolen them to leverage a deal with the FBI, but now they belonged to her. "Look at this," Penelope murmured, tapping a thick, manicured nail against a recurring account number routed through a bank in the Cayman Islands. "O'Rourke has been bleeding capital for 6 months. His gun-running routes through Gary, Indiana, are hemorrhaging cash. But look at his outgoing expenses. Every 15th of the month, he wires $200,000 to a dummy corporation called Pex Solutions." Leo leaned over her shoulder, his chest brushing lightly against her back. The proximity made her breath hitch. "Who owns Apex Solutions?" Penelope's fingers flew across the keyboard, running a rapid trace through a back door she had installed in the federal database years ago. Code lines reflected in her thick glasses until a name finally popped onto the screen. The room went dead silent. "Apex Solutions," Penelope breathed, her voice trembling with the weight of her discovery. "Is registered to a maiden name, Margaret Miller, its agent Thomas Miller's mother." Leo's grip on the back of Penelope's chair tightened so hard the wood groaned. The FBI raid, the aggressive tactics, The inside informant. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. Thomas Miller wasn't a righteous crusader trying to bring down the Chicago mob. He was a dirty cop on Victor O'Rourke's payroll. O'Rourke was using the full weight of the federal government to wipe out Leo Castiglione, eliminating his biggest rival without ever having to fire a single bullet himself. "Miller is a mercenary," Leo snarled softly, his dark eyes burning with lethal intent. "He engineered that raid to put me away, so O'Rourke could seize the ports, and when you took the fall, you ruined their perfect timeline." Before Penelope could respond, the heavy oak doors of the dining room flew open. A bloodied foot soldier stumbled inside, clutching his shoulder. "Boss," the soldier gasped, collapsing against the doorframe. "O'Rourke, he made a move. They just firebombed the logistics warehouse on Lower Wacker Drive. 3 of our guys are dead. He's claiming the city." Chaos erupted. Dante and Rocco drew their weapons, shouting orders into their radios. Leo remained frozen, staring at the screen, displaying Miller's offshore accounts. Penelope didn't panic. The same icy resolve that had allowed her to swallow federal evidence settled over her heavy frame. She stood up, her physical presence suddenly commanding the room. "Leo," Penelope said, her voice slicing through the shouting. "O'Rourke is desperate. If he's firebombing warehouses in broad daylight, he knows Ricky failed. He knows we have the drive. He and Miller are panicking." Leo turned to her, the violence in his eyes temporarily held at bay by her calm logic. "They want a war. I'll give them a war. I'll send 50 men to O'Rourke's compound in Southside tonight." "No," Penelope countered sharply. "That's exactly what Miller wants. If you retaliate violently, Miller uses his FBI badge to arrest you for domestic terrorism. You lose, and they win." Leo stepped closer to her, ignoring the bleeding soldier and the frantic enforcers. "Then what do we do, Penelope?" "We don't shoot them," Penelope said, a cold, ruthless smile touching her lips, a smile she had learned entirely from him. "We expose them. We set a trap they can't possibly resist. And I know exactly what bait to use." Midnight rain slicked the cobblestones of the Fulton Market district, reflecting the neon signs of abandoned meat-packing plants. The area was historically known for spilling blood, a fitting stage for the climax of a Mafia war. Agent Thomas Miller sat behind the steering wheel of his unmarked federal sedan, his knuckles white. Beside him sat Victor O'Rourke, a brutally scarred Irishman who smelled of cheap cigars and expensive cologne. "This better not be a setup, Miller," O'Rourke growled, checking the magazine of his submachine gun. "My men are surrounding the perimeter, but if Castiglione tries anything, I'll kill you myself." "It's not Castiglione," Miller snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's the fat secretary. She contacted my burner phone 2 hours ago. She's terrified. She said Castiglione figured out she kept the hard drive, and she's running for her life. She wants witness protection in exchange for handing over the physical micro SD card." O'Rourke sneered. "And you believe her?" "She's a civilian, Victor," Miller scoffed aggressively. "She's soft, she's overweight, and she's a coward. Castiglione probably threatened her, and her nerves shattered. If we get that drive from her tonight, we destroy the evidence of my payments, and we arrest Castiglione tomorrow. It's foolproof." Inside the cavernous, dimly lit interior of an abandoned slaughterhouse, Penelope stood entirely alone. The air was freezing, biting through her thick wool coat, but she did not shiver. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her heavy ribs, but she forced her posture to remain perfectly straight. Heavy metal doors groaned open, and Miller stepped inside, his FBI-issued firearm drawn. O'Rourke followed closely behind, flanking him with his weapon raised. "Ms. Harper," Miller called out, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Step out into the light. Keep your hands where I can see them." Penelope stepped forward, her thick-soled shoes echoing on the concrete. She held a small, clear plastic evidence bag in her right hand. Inside rested the tiny micro SD card. "I have it," Penelope said, forcing her voice to tremble, playing the pathetic role they expected of her. "I want immunity. I want a new identity. Just get me away from him." Miller chuckled darkly, lowering his gun slightly. "You really are a stupid woman, Penelope. Did you actually think I was going to put a liability like you in witness protection?" O'Rourke stepped forward, a cruel grin splitting his scarred face. "Give me the drive, sweetheart. Then we're going to put 2 in the back of your head and dump you in the river." Penelope didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, the trembling in her voice completely vanished. She stood her ground, her heavy frame radiating an unexpected, terrifying authority. "I don't think you're going to do that, Agent Miller," Penelope said smoothly. "And why the hell not?" Miller sneered. "Because," a dark, gravelly voice echoed from the rafters, "you are standing in a dead zone." Floodlights violently snapped on, blinding Miller and O'Rourke. The massive warehouse was suddenly illuminated like a stadium. From the catwalks above, 24 laser sights cut through the dusty air, painting glowing red dots across the chests and foreheads of both the corrupt FBI agent and the Irish mob boss. Leo Castiglione emerged from the shadows behind Penelope, looking like a god of war in a bespoke, tailored suit. He walked up to her, casually placing a protective hand on her thick waist, pulling her heavy curves against his side. Miller panicked, raising his weapon toward Leo. "FBI! Drop your weapons!" "Your badge is meaningless here, Thomas," Leo said coldly. "My men jammed the cellular signals in a 3-block radius. Your backup can't hear you. O'Rourke's men outside are already dead or restrained." O'Rourke cursed viciously, realizing they had walked directly into a slaughter. "You think you can just execute a federal agent, Castiglione? The heat will burn your entire empire to the ground." "I have no intention of killing a federal agent," Leo replied smoothly. "Penelope, would you care to explain?" Penelope smiled, a sharp, brilliant expression. She held up the plastic bag containing the micro SD card. "This isn't your offshore ledger, Agent Miller. This is a broadcast device. While we've been standing here, I've been live streaming this entire conversation directly to the personal servers of the Director of the FBI, the Attorney General, and the Internal Affairs Bureau in Washington, D.C. Miller's face went paper white. His badge fell from his trembling hands, clattering against the concrete. "I decrypted your accounts, Miller," Penelope continued, stepping forward, her heavy boots crushing his discarded badge. "I traced every bribe Victor O'Rourke ever paid you. The feds aren't coming to arrest Mr. Castiglione tonight. They are currently pulling up to your house to arrest your mother for corporate fraud, and they are mobilizing a tactical team to arrest you for corruption, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder." Sirens wailed in the distance, a rapidly approaching crescendo of federal justice. The real FBI was coming, and they were coming for their own. "You're a dead man, Castiglione," O'Rourke roared, raising his submachine gun in a final, suicidal attempt at revenge. Before O'Rourke could even pull the trigger, Leo drew his 1911 and fired twice. The deafening cracks echoed through the warehouse as O'Rourke collapsed to the floor, dead before he hit the concrete. Miller fell to his knees, sobbing hysterically as the warehouse doors burst open and legitimate federal agents swarmed the room, tackling the corrupt agent to the ground. Through the chaos, Leo holstered his weapon and turned to Penelope. The gunfire, the screaming, the flashing red and blue lights, none of it mattered. He cupped her soft, round face in his large hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "You magnificent, brilliant woman," Leo whispered fiercely. And right there, in the middle of a collapsing criminal empire, Leo Castiglione leaned down and kissed his secretary. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a desperate, consuming claim. Penelope gasped, her heavy arms wrapping around his neck, finally letting herself hold the man she had sacrificed everything for. She tasted gunpowder and expensive scotch, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely, undeniably invincible. Winter surrendered to a crisp, biting spring, and the skyline of Chicago transformed under the shifting season. In the span of 3 months, the underworld had been entirely rewritten. The fall of Thomas Miller and Victor O'Rourke had created a massive power vacuum, but it didn't stay empty for long. Leo Castiglione stepped into the void, absorbing the shattered remains of the Irish syndicate and unifying the city's factions under an iron grip. But the true architect of this new era wasn't the feared mob boss. It was the woman sitting behind the sprawling, custom-built mahogany desk on the penthouse floor of Castiglione Enterprises. Penelope Harper had not magically shrunk. She had not gone on a crash diet to fit into the razor-thin ideals of the criminal elite's wives and mistresses. Instead, the world had reshaped itself to fit her. She wore a breathtaking, sharply tailored emerald green suit that celebrated her heavy curves, her thick hair styled in a sleek blowout, and her lips painted a confident crimson. The bulky wool cardigans and sensible orthopedic shoes were gone, replaced by imported silks and custom leather boots that commanded respect with every heavy step. She was no longer the invisible secretary. She was the undisputed financial queen of the Castiglione Empire. The heavy glass doors of her office swung open, and 3 of Leo's top capos walked in. 6 months ago, these men would have brushed past her desk without a second glance, perhaps dropping a crude joke about her weight. Today, they stopped entirely, respectfully removing their hats and waiting for her permission to speak. "Sit down, gentlemen," Penelope ordered, her voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. They quickly took their seats around her desk. Penelope leaned back in her plush leather chair, her sharp mind already dissecting the quarterly laundering reports. She didn't flinch. She didn't stammer. The crucible of the federal interrogation room had burned away her anxiety, leaving only pure, uncut diamond behind. "I've reviewed the logistics routes for the newly acquired South Side ports," Penelope began, sliding 3 distinct folders across the polished wood. "Your efficiency is down 12%, and your operational costs are climbing. This is unacceptable. Moving forward, the following protocols are non-negotiable. 0 unauthorized shipments. Every crate passing through the Navy Pier must have dual signature clearance from my office. Totosu, mandatory digital scrubbing. We are migrating from offshore wire transfers to heavily encrypted cryptocurrency tumbling. I have provided the software tokens in your folders." Absolute silence on the payroll. Any associate it caught flashing undeclared cash or drawing law enforcement attention will not be fired. They will be handed over to Dante. The capos swallowed hard, nodding in unison. They feared Leo's violence, but they were absolutely terrified of Penelope's intellect. She could bankrupt a man, erase his digital identity, and seize his assets before he even finished his morning coffee. "Understood, Miss Harper," the eldest capo muttered, respectfully taking his folder. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." "Dismissed," Penelope replied coolly, returning her attention to her monitor. As the men scrambled out of the office, the private side door connected to the executive suite clicked open. Leo Castiglione leaned against the doorframe, a dark, immensely proud smile playing on his lips. He watched her with a hunger that still made Penelope's heart skip a beat, even after months of waking up in his massive bed. "You're terrifying when you talk about cryptocurrency. You know that?" Leo murmured, walking slowly across the plush carpet. "Somebody has to keep this family from bleeding cash, Leo," Penelope countered with a playful smirk, closing her laptop. Leo rounded the desk, bypassing her chair entirely. He reached down, gripping her thick waist, and effortlessly pulled her up into his arms. Penelope gasped softly as she was pressed against his solid chest, her heavy thighs brushing against his tailored slacks. He didn't care about the spreadsheets or the capos. He only cared about the soft, brilliant woman in his arms. "Arthur called this morning," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble as his thumbs traced the curve of her hips. "Miller's plea deal was rejected. The Department of Justice is making an example of him. He's going to spend the next 40 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His mother is cooperating with the IRS. Penelope let out a slow breath, resting her hands against Leo's chest. "It's finally over." "No," Leo corrected softly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It's just beginning." He stepped back slightly, reaching into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. Penelope's breath hitched as Leo dropped to one knee, looking up at her with an intensity that made the entire world outside the glass windows completely vanish. He opened a velvet box, revealing a massive, flawless emerald-cut diamond flanked by rubies, set in platinum. It was heavy, substantial, and utterly uncompromising. Exactly like her. "For 5 years you were my shield, Penelope," Leo said, his gravelly voice thick with raw emotion. "You took the blame, you swallowed the evidence, and you walked into a warehouse of armed men without blinking to save my life. You are the smartest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. I don't just want you as my partner in this business. I want you as my wife. I want you as my equal. Forever." Tears pricked the corners of Penelope's eyes, ruining her perfect, intimidating composure. The fat, overlooked secretary from Pilsen, who had resigned herself to a life of quiet loneliness, was looking down at the most dangerous man in the city, entirely at her mercy. "Yes," Penelope whispered, a brilliant, watery smile breaking across her face. "Yes, Leo." Leo slid the heavy ring onto her thick finger, where it fit flawlessly. He stood up, wrapping his arms securely around her soft, substantial body, and kissed her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. The criminal underworld was brutal, unforgiving, and drenched in blood. But as Penelope held the Mafia Don, who worshipped the ground she walked on, she knew one absolute truth. She was exactly where she was meant to be. What an absolute thrill ride! From a terrifying federal interrogation room to ruling the entire Chicago underworld, Penelope proved that true strength and brilliance come in all shapes and sizes. Her incredible sacrifice not only saved Leo Castiglione, but crowned her the undisputed queen of the Mafia empire.